If you walked the streets of 19th century Copenhagen, you would find a society that felt it had figured everything out. The city was comfortable, educated, and polite. Religion and philosophy weren't matters of deep existential dread. They were state-sponsored defaults, as routine as buying groceries or attending the theater. The prevailing intellectual trend of the day promised that every human struggle could be smoothed over by a tidy philosophical system. If you had a problem, society had a prescribed answer. Life was presented as a flat, easily navigable plane, where all the rough edges of human existence were neatly sanded down by the group consensus. Søren Kierkegaard was the ultimate anomaly in this environment. He was physically frail, walked with a slight deformity, and carried a burden of deep melancholy. Yet hidden behind his awkward exterior was a lethal intellect. He looked at the well-adjusted citizens around him and diagnosed a terminal illness. He saw a public suffering from the sickness of the crowd. To Kierkegaard, his peers were outsourcing their identities, their morality, and their beliefs to the group. They were drifting through life on autopilot, mistaking social conformity for actual living. The problem with trying to wake up a crowd is that you cannot simply preach to people who think they already possess the truth. So Kierkegaard deployed a tactic he called indirect communication. He wrote under a bizarre web of pseudonyms, creating fictional authors who argued with each other, specifically to lay philosophical traps that would force the reader to think for themselves. This entire literary campaign was a calculated assault on complacency. He mapped out a brutal three-stage journey that a person must endure to escape the gravity of the crowd and achieve a truly authentic existence. The first of these stages is the aesthetic sphere. This is life lived purely for the moment. The aesthetic person avoids commitment at all costs, pursuing pleasure, romance, and intellectual superiority while maintaining an ironic distance from any real responsibility. In his work In Vino Veritas, Kierkegaard pictures this life as an extravagant banquet, but the endless pursuit of pleasure has a terrifying endpoint. Without a fixed purpose, the aesthetic life eventually falls apart into disconnected impulses. The individual becomes a slave to mere accident, drifting into deep despair. The antidote to that despair is the transition into the ethical sphere. Here, the individual makes a choice. They submit to what Kierkegaard calls the general law. They choose a career, they enter into a marriage, and they take on concrete duties, trading the vague possibilities of youth for specific, grounded commitments. Kierkegaard actually tried to live this out. He fell deeply in love and became engaged to a young woman named Regine Olsen. It was the perfect ethical setup. But after a period of intense agonizing, he made the deliberate, devastating decision to break it off. He broke the engagement because his own unshakable melancholy and a growing sense of a divine calling made him realize that conforming to societal norms couldn't be his final destination. The ethical life is stable, but for Kierkegaard, it was only a stepping stone to something far more severe. That severity is found in the highest stage of existence, the religious sphere, which he outlines in his masterpiece, Fear and Trembling. To show what the religious life demands, he uses the story of Abraham and Isaac. Here is the absolute paradox. The universal moral law dictates a father must not murder his son, yet Abraham is given an incomprehensible command to do exactly that. Acting on this command requires what Kierkegaard calls the leap of faith. It is a solitary act of infinite resignation. Because this choice defies logic and breaks the rules of society, the believer cannot explain it to anyone else. They become completely alienated from the crowd. Kierkegaard experienced his own version of this alienation. A popular satirical paper called The Corsair turned its sights on him. Week after week, the press mocked his ideas, his spindly legs, and his habit of carrying an umbrella. He was harassed in the streets and became a walking punchline for the masses. He wrote that he was being grinned to death. But this public crucifixion proved his central thesis. The authentic individual, striving for absolute truth, will inevitably be misunderstood, mocked, and persecuted by the complacent crowd. The mockery sparked something fierce in him. In his final years, Kierkegaard abandoned his pseudonyms and the elaborate literary traps. He went to war directly. He aimed his fire straight at the state-sponsored church. He declared that modern Christendom was a massive, systemic delusion that had entirely inverted the teachings of its founder. He compared institutional history to a reversed filtration process. Instead of purifying an idea, the institution takes a radical truth and slowly adds impurities. Generation by generation, it sands down the rough edges until a demanding ideal becomes perfectly smooth, identical, and highly profitable. To Kierkegaard, relying on objective Christianity, paying your taxes, sitting in a pristine pew, and checking off societal beliefs actually makes you a heathen. Truth requires subjective passion. It requires inwardness. The challenge he leaves behind is inescapable. You can comfortably disappear into the crowd and let society compose your life for you. Or you can accept the terrifying, solitary responsibility of becoming a single individual.